Martin McCutcheon, Maurice Gibb, Engelbert Humperdinck, Jane McDonald and Ross Kemp are among the celebrities gathered to salute the work of one of Britain's most famous performers.
Barbara Windsor!
Join Del Winton and a host of stars for a night of songs and celebration as the nation's favourite landlady, Barbara Windsor, becomes the first person to enter the BBC Hall of Fame. Saturday at 9:05 on BBC One.
Now on BBC One Scotland, the BBC News and Reporting Scotland with Hugh Edwards and Abir Parks.
Formula One's David Coulthard narrowly escapes death in a plane crash. His fiancée is also rescued, but the two pilots are killed. After yesterday's rioting, police are now accused of failing to act more promptly. Good chance of a Rover deal, says the new man talking to BMW. Just 18 hours at sea and the 200 million superliner breaks down.
Also tonight, we're live in David Coulthard's hometown for reaction to that plane crash. We don't expect the truth. That's the verdict of the Lockerbie families on the eve of the trial. And a man is charged with culpable homicide after the motorway incident which killed this baby.
Good evening. David Coulthard, the Formula One driver, has survived a plane crash in France which killed the aircraft's two pilots. The private Learjet crashed while making an emergency landing at Lyon airport. Mr. Coulthard escaped through a window and then went back to rescue his fiancée. More details now from our correspondent, John McIntyre.
Astonishingly, David Coulthard and his girlfriend walked away from the crash almost unscathed. Their private Learjet almost torn in two after crash landing at Lyon. The aircraft had burst into flames on impact. Tragically, the pilot and co-pilot were killed when the private twin-engined Learjet nosedived on approach as it was making an emergency landing. They'd been flying from Farnborough in Hampshire when they were diverted to Lyon-Satelet after radioing that they were suffering from engine problems. Airport officials say the pilots would have died instantly.
The cockpit split in two. There was an explosion. One person got out. I think it was David Coulthard. He immediately went back. Two other people got out.
Coulthard and his fiancée Heidi Winchelski, who were en route to Nice before heading to their home in Monaco, certainly had a lucky escape. They were taken to a nearby hospital along with their bodyguard, who was also unhurt.
The three passengers, of whom one is David Coulthard, are apparently only slightly hurt, if hurt at all. But they are in a hospital in central Lyon undergoing a checkup, and we'll know more about their state shortly, I think.
Coulthard won the British Grand Prix just over a week ago. Remarkably, he is expected to drive in the Spanish Grand Prix this coming weekend. According to McLaren Mercedes, their star Formula One driver will be allowed to leave hospital after tests are carried out.
Well, it remains to be seen, of course, what the hospital have to say and also his state of mind. I mean, he is one of the more sensitive souls, as you might say, in the Formula One paddock. There are those who'd almost seem to relish such brushes with death. I mean,
so far, no details of the dead pilots have been released. An investigation into the accident has already started. But the crash is undoubtedly an amazing escape for Coulthard, a man who's more used to putting his life on the line on the racetrack. John McIntyre, BBC News.
And for the latest from France, let's join our correspondent, John Sopel, who's in Paris. John, what more can you tell us at this stage?
Well, the authorities in Paris say there will be a full accident inquiry into the circumstances of the crash. Just before we came on air, I spoke to the hospital in Lyon, and they have now been released from hospital and are making their way, presumably, to their onward destination, which was Monaco, where David Coulthard has a home. Indeed, such was his state of relaxedness, apparently, after the crash, that once he had gone back for his fiancée and rescued the bodyguard as well, they stood on the tarmac, not quite knowing what to do, and according to an engineer who saw the whole thing, that Mr. Coulthard sat and made a few phone calls on the tarmac before being taken to hospital, where he's had this checkup. Now, obviously, there'll be a question of whether there's any kind of delayed shock to what happened, but it seems that he has had the most remarkable escape. He's been released from hospital tonight, and he could well be taking part in the Grand Prix at the weekend.
John Sopel in Paris, thank you very much indeed. Now, you can keep in touch with that story as it develops during the evening on our digital channel. That's BBC News 24. Now, the Prime Minister says he's determined there'll be no repeat of yesterday's rioting in central London. 97 people were arrested after property was wrecked and monuments to the war dead defaced. Police tactics, notably their reluctance to intervene at an early stage, have now been questioned by the Conservatives, as our correspondent Carol Walker now reports.
The statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square was swiftly cleaned up this morning. But there's been an outcry as to why the demonstrators were able to carry out such vandalism. This was how they left the monument to Britain's wartime leader. The cenotaph commemorating the nation's war dead was also defaced. The Prime Minister went to see it as efforts to remove the graffiti continued.
This is a memorial honouring people who gave their lives for this country, and really, people can make their point and they can make the demonstration, but they should not be allowed to do this. It's a total disgrace and we should put a stop to it.
The demonstration turned violent with the ransacking of McDonald's in Whitehall. It was at this point that the police moved in force. But questions have been raised as to why they allowed the protesters to move at will throughout Parliament Square and Whitehall for so long. The Home Secretary has condemned what he described as criminality and thuggery masquerading as political protest. But in the Commons, he pledged his full support for the police.
Knowing the determination of some of those involved to perpetrate serious violence and disorder, the police had to make a fine judgment that it was better to contain the trouble, as they did, in confined areas than seek to bar people from those areas with a high risk of wholly unpredictable outbreaks of even more serious violence to the public as well as to the police and property virtually anywhere else in central London.
The Shadow Home Secretary asked why it seemed the police did not act until offences had been carried out.
But I think the Home Secretary will be aware that there is a considerable amount of public concern at the amount of activity and disorder which was allowed to take place before the police decided that it was the proper time for intervention.
The Liberal Democrats' Home Affairs spokesman Simon Hughes asked why more had not been done to protect monuments like the cenotaph. The protesters had refused to discuss their plans with the police in advance. Officers insisted their tactics were designed to prevent worse violence.
We were not allowing these offences to take place with no accountability. We were gathering evidence, but you have to also say, is it worth almost starting a riot? And I think that's what we would be accused of, to enforce minor offences of criminal damage against the turf in Parliament Square. I don't think it was, and we made a very conscious decision that we would gather evidence and hold those people to account at a later date.
One of the groups involved in the protest, commenting on the graffiti on the cenotaph, said they respected and celebrated those who'd stood up to fascism.
We do not necessarily celebrate the generals and the ruling class that send people to their deaths in order to protect the privileges and the control of the few. The abhorrence of sending millions of men to their deaths in the trenches dwarfs the stupidity of any possible slogan on any possible piece of stone.
None of the nation's wartime monuments suffered irreparable damage and no one was seriously hurt, but the protesters did inflict symbolic harm, and the Labour government is all too aware of it. The Prime Minister has called on relatives of the rioters to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. Carol Walker, BBC News, Parliament Square.
Well, let's go to one of the scenes of yesterday's rioting, the cenotaph in Whitehall, and join our correspondent Nicholas Witchell. Nick, this criticism of the police for failing to act more promptly, we've heard there one of the responses. What more is being said in response to this criticism?
First thing to remember, I think, Hugh, as we heard in that report, is that the police knew virtually nothing about what to expect yesterday. These protest groups had not communicated any information about what they were planning to the police. Second point, police were determined to avoid the example of how the American police reacted to anti-capitalist protests in Seattle and Washington recently. We do things rather differently here, was how one senior officer put it. They would believe that they are rather more subtle, more fluid than the application of massive force in the early stages of a demonstration. Police yesterday wanted to give these protesters a chance to exercise their right to free, democratic, peaceful protest. And for the first 3 hours, we mustn't forget that though it was chaotic, it was essentially peaceful. And police, I think, were mindful of the fact that if they had intervened in those first hours when it was essentially peaceful, they, the police, would have caused a riot, and they would today perhaps be being accused of overreaction rather than underreaction.
Well, no doubting the anger of Mr Blair's reaction today, Nick, saying that he's determined that this won't happen again. How on earth can politicians make sure that this thing doesn't happen again?
The view in Downing Street, as I understand it, is this. It was right yesterday to give them that chance to peaceful protest. They have now had their chance. They have shown that they cannot be trusted to exercise that right peacefully. As Downing Street puts it, next year, police tactics can be expected to be different.
Nicholas Witchell, thank you very much indeed. Ken Livingstone, the independent candidate for Mayor of London, has been attacked by rivals for allegedly encouraging yesterday's violence. They say Mr Livingstone's support for direct action gave the rioters just the excuse they needed, but the Livingstone campaign says it's all a lie.
The graffiti had barely dried on the walls before the mayoral candidates took to the streets, the Labour candidate carefully in step with the Home Secretary. But today all the parties agreed who to blame: Ken Livingstone.
It was only earlier this year he was talking about if people came over here for the World Trade Organization, he'd want to erect some stocks and have people throwing things at them. He talks about taking direct action, and the people who were causing the trouble yesterday were people who, like him, believe in direct action.
Shame for these kind of people.
We all
do,
don't we?
Dreadful, really dreadful.
Moments earlier, on the same spot, the Tory candidate was sharing the sense of outrage and getting his attack on Mr Livingstone on record.
He supports direct action, he thinks all of this is terrifically amusing, and who then simply thinks he can get out of it by uttering a few ritual words of condemnation afterwards. You can't do that. You have to make it plain from the outset that free speech is one thing, but this kind of action is another, and it is wholly unacceptable.
Ken was out there praising direct action, talking about putting the WTO in stocks. Obviously, that gave a license to the people who were out on the streets yesterday and wanted to cause trouble. And I have to say, our thanks to the Metropolitan Police, because they contained the whole situation. It didn't become a riot like Seattle.
Condoning this kind of disorder would cost any candidate votes. Mr Livingstone did support what he called direct action, but he says he meant peaceful protest, not this. And when his opponents say he's the rioters' friend, it's a smear.
I've talked about the policies, and so many of my opponents has just been one smear or negative campaigning or personality attacks. I don't think Londoners know none of the candidates for mayors in favour of violence, and it's silly to suggest that they are. I thought the police handled things very well.
After yesterday's riot, praising the police has been mandatory for all the mayoral candidates. The mayor won't have the power to ban marches or approve them, but whoever wins on Thursday will have a lot of influence and the power to grab headlines at will. The fact that all the parties are so keen to lay blame at Ken Livingstone's door shows that after this bitter and personal election campaign, he's still the man they have to catch. John Pienaar, BBC News, Central London.
And there are 11 candidates standing in the elections for Mayor of London. There's the list. The voting takes place on Thursday, of course. The man promising to save thousands of jobs at Rover said a short time ago that he was extremely positive of reaching a deal with BMW. John Towers, who leads the Phoenix Consortium, has been locked in talks with BMW throughout the day. But time is fast running out for the Longbridge works, and if a deal can't be done by the end of the month, the plant will close.
Towers, BBC Television.
How did it go today, sir?
Finally, the man to rescue Rover went public. After weeks of no information, John Towers now has all the facts. A short time ago here, after the first full day talking to BMW.
We've managed to identify the very few remaining items that our teams are going to have to work on for the rest of this week. And it's all going in the right direction. Thanks very much.
BMW set a deadline for the end of
Echoed from BMW headquarters tonight. Optimistic was the word there, but some way to go yet. Who picks up redundancy bills to be sorted out? Meanwhile, the man who walked away from a deal with BMW on Friday, John Moulton, who fronts the rival Alchemy bid, said his door remained open. But Longbridge is still in the balance. 2 bids for it then on BMW's table. If both fail, Longbridge closes.
Got a fish.
Hey.
It all preys on the minds of the Andrews family. John Andrews does tonight's night shift at Longbridge. He and his wife Sue worry about their future and that of their son Jonathan, just one of thousands of families.
You worry about your mortgage payments, whether you're going to have a wage coming in to pay your mortgage. Mortgage protection, you can't get any. You can't swap your mortgage if you wanted to save money by swapping your mortgage, because nobody will have you because of the predicament of Rover itself. 1 minute it's Alchemy, the next minute it's the Towers bid, then next minute Alchemy and back in the story again. I mean, basically, you don't know what's happening from one day to the next.
It's like constant mind games, you know.
The mind games will go on for some time between Munich and London, a meticulous ploughing through legalities and finance, a long way from the Andrews household, where they continue to campaign as best they can. On Friday, the most likely outcome was complete closure. Today, it's some struggling future for Rover. Redundancies certainly, but some future. Stephen Evans, BBC News.
A sickening racist attack. That's how police have described an assault in which a black man was set on fire by 3 white men. Police in Birmingham say the 24-year-old victim was sprayed in the face with flammable liquid and then set alight.
The victim, a 24-year-old black man, was attacked on one of Birmingham's busiest roads. In the early hours of Monday morning, a group of men passing in a car shouted racist abuse. They then got out, sprayed the victim with a flammable liquid and set fire to him.
We are treating it as a racist attack simply because just prior to the liquid being sprayed in the victim's face, he was racially abused and then he was set on fire with this liquid that we do not know what it contains.
The police are this evening studying closed-circuit television footage of the road. A team of officers has been in the area all day. An independent group which monitors racial attacks in Birmingham say they are concerned.
I'm just horrified that things like this can happen, and it's getting out of proportion.
This case comes just weeks after athlete Asha Hansen's white boyfriend was stabbed by racists outside her Birmingham home. The police say that serious racial crime is still relatively rare, but those who've been a victim say racism is constant.
You could go on forever, people shouting and the same people that you've helped and done things for standing out your door. You get to this stage where you just think, I'll rise above this. You've obviously got the problem, I haven't.
This evening, the victim of this weekend's attack, who's asked not to be named, has been released from hospital after treatment for burns. The police now have 25 officers trying to catch the people who attacked him. Richard Bilton, BBC News, Birmingham.
Time is 16 minutes past 6. In a few moments, the hostage crisis in the Philippines. Kidnappers now exchange fire with troops. Battling to save the British film industry, why blockbusters like this one may not be enough.
And in 15 minutes, all Scotland's top stories, sport, a full weather forecast and a sting in the tail. Will a failure to prescribe drugs lead to Scots MS sufferers injecting themselves with bee venom? And a warning to footballers, heading the ball could seriously damage your health.
The glory of the P&O fleet, the cruise liner Aurora, has broken down on her maiden voyage. Launched just last week by the Princess Royal, the superliner spent a mere 18 hours at sea before developing propeller trouble. The ship cost £200 million and there were 2,000 passengers on board for this first cruise.
Her opening appearance could hardly have been more spectacular. Dwarfing the world's tall ships, the 200-foot-high Aurora took centre stage. A curtain raiser to the formal naming ceremony performed by the Princess Royal and accompanied by ticker tape, fanfares and several thousand guests. There was, however, one moment which may have been a bad omen. Less than a week after the champagne bottle failed to break, Aurora's captain was reporting a PR disaster.
She'd set sail from Southampton at this time yesterday evening, and she should have been in Lisbon this afternoon. She'd then sail on to the Mediterranean, visiting some of Europe's most famous resorts, including Monte Carlo and Naples. Well, this is where she actually got to just 18 hours into her showpiece voyage.
We certainly shouldn't have expected. The ship had been through very intensive trials, had operated at far higher speeds than she was operating at last night. So at the moment, we can't quite understand what's gone wrong.
Those sea trials, carried out after Aurora's departure from a German dockyard, are intended to test the ship to its limits, particularly important since her sister ship Oriana developed a similar fault on her maiden voyage. The technical inquest now underway will be small comfort to passengers who paid up to £7,000 for the 3-week trip. They're due back in Southampton tomorrow morning, with P&O facing a multi-million-pound compensation bill. Robert Hall, BBC News.
It's been a day of hard bargaining in Downing Street as leading figures try to get the Northern Ireland peace process moving once again. David Trimble, the Ulster Unionist leader, says he still doesn't know whether the IRA is prepared to hand in its weapons. Sinn Féin have been talking to Mr Blair and the Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern as well.
The Irish Prime Minister came to Downing Street for what was being billed, by British officials at least, as a review of the deadlock in the peace process. It was to be a litmus test of what progress might or might not be made. Tony Blair, along with Bertie Ahern, is keen to see if the logjam can be broken. In separate meetings with the main Northern Ireland parties, government ideas and those of the parties would be discussed. The Ulster Unionists were out first, and clearly they didn't feel they'd heard what they'd come to hear, that Republicans, Sinn Féin and the IRA were about to move on the decommissioning of weapons.
It really boils down to the question of, are they actually prepared to do anything? And they should tell us what they're prepared to do. The agreement sets out objectives, it sets out things to be achieved. We want to see that happen, but they need to act themselves in order to bring that about.
Sinn Féin was the first party to go in. They were the last to come out. So as the day wore on, it became clear that more than a review, more than had been expected, was taking place inside Number 10. The main nationalist party, the SDLP, was much more upbeat than the Unionists.
Well, naturally, I hope that there's pressure on all parties and on the governments to implement all aspects of the agreement and to resolve the current impasse. And the fact that we're meeting now today and will be meeting within the next couple of days is very encouraging.
And there will be more talks in Belfast on Thursday, showing there's at least something to talk about. Indeed, Sinn Féin was still in with the Prime Ministers after almost 7 hours of talks. From the length of time the Sinn Féin delegation spent inside Number 10, it's a reasonable assumption that most of the pressure has been on them. The governments and the other parties want something from Republicans on decommissioning. These talks will decide the pace of future negotiations. If there's been real progress here, expect the pace to quicken. Dennis Murray, BBC News, Downing Street.
Troops in the Philippines have exchanged gunfire with a group of Islamic militants holding 21 hostages, including tourists from Europe and South Africa. Earlier, a kidnapper threatened to kill 2 hostages if troops didn't back off. The kidnap started 8 days ago on the Malaysian resort of Sipadan. The hostages are now being held on the remote island of Jolo, as our World Affairs correspondent Peter Biles now reports.
The warning that 2 of the hostages could be beheaded by their captors came in a telephone call to a local radio station in the southern Philippines. A man claiming to be one of the kidnappers demanded that government forces must pull back from the area where the foreign tourists are thought to be held by the rebels on the island of Jolo. The hostages were seized from a Malaysian diving resort by armed men in a speedboat more than a week ago. The most recent pictures show them huddled together in squalid conditions. Many of them are now reported to be ill. They've been allowed to display notes addressed to relatives and friends, and some have voiced concern about the danger they face if the government tries to use force to end the crisis. Filipino troops apparently have orders to stay in the background while the authorities try to negotiate with the kidnappers. But the scene today at this military hospital confirmed reports that clashes had occurred between government forces and rebels surrounding the hostages. One soldier was said to have been killed and a number of others were treated for injuries after an outbreak of shooting when rebels tried to break through a military cordon. This is just the latest incident in the conflict with Muslim separatists. The Philippines government describes the kidnappers merely as bandits seeking ransom money. But with foreign tourists now involved, there's pressure on Manila to resolve the crisis quickly. Peter Biles, BBC News.
The situation in Zimbabwe is again under discussion. Foreign ministers from 8 Commonwealth countries have been meeting in London. Robin Cook, the Foreign Secretary, said he hoped to send a clear message to President Mugabe of Zimbabwe to end the farm invasions and announce a date for elections. 8 British holidaymakers were among nearly 100 tourists who had a lucky escape when their cruise liner hit a reef in the Pacific. The captain of the World Discovery had to beach the liner 20 miles north of the capital of the Solomon Islands so that the passengers had time to escape in the lifeboats. Cricket's in a mess with all the allegations of match fixing, of course, so the sports governing body is meeting today to try to get a grip on things. The ICC, as it's known, has been roundly attacked for an apparent reluctance to act decisively. So what steps will they take? Let's ask our sports correspondent, Adam Minot, who's at Lord's. Adam, any word yet?
Not at this stage, no, Hugh. I think it's a measure, though, of how deep the crisis is here, that the ICC Executive Board, who met here at Lord's today, felt it necessary to sign a declaration at the beginning of the meeting today, saying that they had no financial interest whatsoever in cricket outside what is already on the public record. We're going to get a full idea of what went on tomorrow after the two-day meeting has ended. But I understand that one thing that's on the table is a suggestion that there should be an amnesty for any player or official or anyone involved in the game, so they can come forward, tell the ICC what's been going on in the game, any taint of corruption, so that this can clear it out of the way. Whether they'll be able to put this into practice simply remains to be seen.
Adam at Lord's, thank you very much. Notting Hill and The Full Monty, two spectacular British successes at the box office, of course, but for each success story, there are, let's not forget, hundreds of flops, which is why they've now launched a new body with a multi-million-pound budget to help the British film industry make a few more of those Notting Hills and Full Montys. Here's our arts correspondent, Rosie Millard.
You do have a name. My name is Gladiator.
It's the summer blockbuster which looks likely to clean up at the box office when it's released next week. Gladiator is the latest from British director Ridley Scott, who filmed much of it in the UK. But any profits will go back to the two American companies who produced it. British film talent thrives when backed by Hollywood, but if you take away the Americans, the picture is less positive. Recently, British filmmakers backed by public money have produced a clutch of disastrous movies, and the critics have had a field day. Mad Cows was a national embarrassment. Producers should have demanded rewrites for shooting fish, and Keep the Aspidistra Flying was further evidence of what is wrong with the British film industry. By restructuring and streamlining public funding for film, the new Film Council hopes to stabilise and boost the industry. Its main role is to give lottery money to English films, as Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland already have bodies to handle their grants. And many of the films the Council will be sponsoring from now on will try to be unashamedly mainstream.
I think for many years we suffered from what I call intellectual snobbery. I think those days are gone. The most difficult film to make is a film that has creative integrity, but also can find a wide audience.
Tonight sees the premiere of David Putnam's new movie, My Life So Far. Backed by the Scottish Lottery Fund, it's hoped it will have a wide appeal via a combination of West Highland charm and Colin Firth. My Life So Far involves a British production team with lottery money and a nationwide release across the UK from next week. It's just the sort of entertainment the Film Council hopes we'll be seeing a lot more of in the future, now that it's overseeing the bulk of our homemade movies. Rosie Millard, BBC News, Central London.
Now, a bit cloudy here today, not so elsewhere, as Helen's about to tell us.
Indeed, Hugh, yes. The highest temperature was in Wales today. There you go, something to smile about. Yes, Llanbedr, if I've said that right. I hope I've said it right. Wales, Hugh will tell me if I haven't. Keswick, 19 degrees today, not far behind. And the weather's going to stay very dry and settled for all of us, really, over the next couple of days. The best of the sunshine will always be in the west, though. Now, you can see, though, it wasn't the same on the east coast today. Temperature's only around 9 to 11 degrees. And that cloud is already beginning to roll its way back in across the southeast and across some of these eastern coasts. And that's the story for tonight, really. The cloud pushing its way back in once again. It's toing and froing at the moment, but it is going to end up right across towards Wales and across parts of eastern and western Scotland too by the end of the night. It might just get a little bit of drizzle perhaps in East Anglia, southeast England and in the far northeast of Scotland. But for many of us, a mild night. Temperature at the lowest around 3 degrees in the Scottish Glens and where the skies are clearer elsewhere in western Scotland. For tomorrow, a cloudy, dismal start to the day, cloudier than we saw today in many areas, and that means the cloud's going to be reluctant to clear away. The best of the sunshine in the west, though. The temperatures in the east, 11 to 13, in the west, nearer 17 to 18. That's it from me for now. There'll be more weather coming up.
Helen, thanks very much indeed.